All right. So that was fun. So everybody knows they have to sign the attendance sheet. I will figure out the QR code by next time. I will send a little help desk request to figure out maybe we're not activated or something, or there's something wrong with our particular system. Has anybody done this in any other class? All right, probably I just broke the system, but okay. So does everybody remember what we were working on last time? All right, well, we were talking about the notion of the principles behind economics, and we were all filling out our interactive worksheets. Now, those of you who were not in the first class, do not panic. This presentation, this PowerPoint is up online, so you can still fill it out. But in your folder is the interactive note guide. Oh, fantastic. At least we have something.
Yeah.
So, in your notebooks, the interactive note taking, we're on what page of the interactive note taking, my dear? Second page? Yeah, okay. If you didn't get the first page filled out, you can go online to engage. I do know that the presentation's up there because that's how I just accessed this, so I know it's there. And you can obviously get the notes from what you missed. When do you post it by? When do you get your mind tap done by? Okay, way to go, good time. Okay. So we were talking about the principles, and we got through the individual principles. So we got through what individuals thought and what principles were driving individual decisions in economics. So we're going to talk about Mustangs. So let's pretend we have a 1996 Mustang. Not a particularly great year, by the way. Kind of ugly Mustang, but that's okay. And you've already spent $1,000 on your repairs. Bummer. Okay, that was probably your, a lot of your summer earnings. Really big bummer. Your car's fixed now. And then at the last minute, the transmission dies. And you have to pay $600 to fix it. Or you can sell the car as is. In each of these scenarios, we're going to talk about what we should do. The first one is, given the fact that we know the blue book value of the car is $6,500 if the transmission works, at $57 if it doesn't, what should we do? So let's look at A first. Anybody have any ideas? Why should we get it fixed?
Because even though you already put $1,000 in the repairs already, it's only $600 more, and there's an $800 difference. So in actuality, you're making at least $200 depending on what you're actually selling the car.
So did everybody get where that math was coming from? So basically, the way that economists look at this is that we look at the margin. Remember we talked about looking at the margin? Unfortunately, that $1,000 you did in the past is in the past. And what we're saying is okay, if it's not fixed, you're only going to get $5,700. If it's fixed, you're going to get $65. The difference between those two numbers is how much? Right. It's only going to cost you $600. So if you get it fixed, you're going to make $200 more than if you don't get it fixed. That's at the margin. Interesting how this does not work in here. Now, if the equation changes and the blue VIC value goes to $6,000, and if it goes to 55 if it doesn't work, then all of a sudden the difference between the two is only what? You would be negative, you would basically be $100 in the hole if you got it fixed. These are examples of thinking at the margin, and we do this all the time. And all of economics is based on decisions that are made, literally, the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost. And what we're saying is that the past is the past. But are we going to add that extra worker? How much more is that worker going to bring in? How much more is it going to cost us to have that worker? We only care about that one worker, not all the other workers that come before it. Now, this is where we differ from accounting, don't we? Because in accounting, you don't look at things this way. But in economics, all economics decisions are based on right at that margin. So for instance, right now, when we look at the whole notion of tax cuts, etc., we're looking, economists are evaluating that in terms of what effect it'll have on the economy now and in the future, not what happened in the past. So just based on that little bit of cost difference, our whole decision changed. The second principle has to do with how people interact. So the first one was all about you, me, 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 me. Now it's about how in the world do we interact with each other economically. In general, trade makes us all better off. Yeah, we could be self-sufficient. We could live in our own little bubbles, right? We could just, go on our merry way. And actually, if you think about it, this COVID has given us a little feel for how it feels to be all by yourself all the time, right? We could basically specialize in having one good, and that could be it. The thing is, isn't it neater if you are a farmer and you have cows that you can trade with somebody and get eggs or get wheat or get your car repaired or etc., and you don't have to do it all yourself? That's where trade comes in. And countries are in the same position as we are. Countries benefit from trade and specialization. We get better prices for goods that are made abroad if they do what they do best and we do what we do best. And because some goods are better produced elsewhere, we get them cheaper than if we produce them here, as long as there are jobs to be had here producing other goods. Economists look at everything in terms of how can we better society and use our resources. Remember how we talked about those scarce resources that we have? We only have one planet. We only have one set of things we can do. Those scarce resources are all we have. And because that's all we have, trade makes it so that everybody's using the scarce resources the best. We'll get into this a lot more versus when we start looking at the fact that the United States does extremely well in agriculture. Why? We got a lot of land, guys, and we're damn good at using it. However, look at Japan. Japan is a fairly small country. They don't have as much land. It makes sense for Japan to trade with the United States for things that are agricultural, and for us to trade with Japan for things that they do better than we do. We'll leave China out of the equation because there's a lot of issues with the Chinese that are a little bit different, and we'll get into that a little later. When we talk about trade, it works best if everybody's playing on the same and equal for trading field. When people aren't, it gets harder. And with China, there's a whole other set of issues with it. And we'll get into that about 3/4 of the way through the class. So trade made everybody better, and markets are a good way to organize economic activity. What is a market? Anybody have any ideas? It's a group of buyers and sellers, right? It's any time when you actually have a bunch of people buying or selling something. So a market can be as simple as a gasoline station, or it can be as big as the United States or the world. It's a group of buyers and sellers, and they don't have to be in a single location. And this is the cool thing about the internet. The internet economically makes total sense because it creates markets that are much more global. We couldn't be non-global if we tried now, by the way, in case you're wondering. Because of why? When you go on Amazon and you buy something, do you have any clue where it's coming from? What what's the only clue that might give you an idea that it's coming from another country? You got it. How long it takes to get it. That gives you a little bit of a clue. But that's about it, right? It doesn't say, this is being shipped from China, or this is being shipped from Japan. When you buy something from Apple, does it tell you that it's coming from China? Sometimes it comes pretty fast from China for Apple, doesn't it?
Or they lie. They say it's coming from this place in the United States, but it's really not.
Yes, because there may be a distributor in the United States. So for instance, a lot of clothing manufacturers, it'll come from someplace else, come to the distributor in the United States, and then come to you. So when we talk about organizing economic activity, it's the who, what, where, when, and how much thing, right? It's all about economics. So it's about understanding what good we're going to produce, how we're going to produce it. Makes sense, because if we can't, if we don't know how we're going to do it, it's going to be a little hard to do. How much of it to produce, and who gets it. And every economy in the world has to make these decisions. So if you think about it, we give a lot of incentives, not as many as maybe we should, depending on how you feel, to farming in the United States. We as a country and an economy know that agriculture is a good business for us. So the what to produce, let's throw out corn, okay? Corn's a pretty good one. How to produce it? Well, we leave that up to the farmers, right? But we also provide educational systems for the farmers. Schools like K-State started off being ag schools, right? Why? Because we wanted to educate the farmers in how to manage a farm business, which is, by the way, not easy. How much to produce of each? And we'll get into that when we get into supply and demand, because you're going to see how corn has kind of adversely affected soybeans some places in the United States. And who gets them? Now, our trading partners are directly associated with who gets our product. So trade deals that the United States makes about corn directly affect the farmers, right? And tariffs that are put on our corn directly affect the farmers. So this is a market system, and this is how we organize our activity. This is the preferred way for economists. Economists like the notion of a free market system. You're going to hear the free market system a lot in this class. And the notion there is that the economy itself and the people in the economy and the decisions that we make as consumers are affecting and basically allocating our resources in the most effective way possible based on what we consider to be important and non-important as a country. Not as a politician, but as a country. Because remember, every time you buy something, you are making an economic vote. As we well know, Principle 6, markets are a good way to organize this activity. There is a famous principle. They still have not fixed the AV in here, so we will not be watching this video. That will be next week's issue. But in 1776, did anything happen in the United States in 1776? Was it a big year? It was a small revolution? Did we become independent? So at the same time we're doing all this, a man by the name of Adam Smith, who was a Scotsman, the bitter irony of that is amazing, because you know how the English felt about the Scot about this time, not particularly great, wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, in which he described the interaction between households and firms and how we produce things as an invisible hand, basically allocating our resources. What's this invisible hand? This visible hand is the total economic forces that affect things. So for instance, if farmers are producing corn and all of a sudden in the United States there is a big enormous health kick and corn becomes the evil. If you eat corn, you're going to die 20 years earlier than if you don't. This is a new study. And everybody starts believing it, right? Then what happens? No one buys corn. So all of a sudden, all that corn that's been produced, and the consumers, the demand for corn has been reduced drastically, but the supply of corn has already been produced, it's already there. So what happens to the price of corn? It gets pushed downward because the demand's pushing it downward, like an invisible hand pushing it. And we'll start to see that when we start to look at this. That invisible hand is the forces of market. And if left by itself, eventually farmers will say, what will the farmers say? No more corn, I'm going to produce soybeans. These damn consumers, I was left with all this damn corn, right? So you start producing soybeans. Now all of a sudden, even if you decided that you loved corn so much that you were going to die 20 years early, you can't get it, can you? Because we've moved. So what has happened is the economy has adjusted itself. This is the invisible hand. And you'll hear this a lot in economics because we want this notion that the market will adjust itself. No one has to get involved. Now, what happens a lot in the economy today? Madison, you get to be the politician today. This is wrong. My constituents are farmers and they're very, very, very upset. What happens? We got to bail them out. So we start throwing money. Probably not enough to keep the farmers alive, but enough that it looks good, right? Now all of a sudden, the farmers no longer think that they should switch over to soybeans. We've artificially changed the economy. Adam Smith said we shouldn't do that. We should just let the economy go as it should go. Unfortunately, you will see over and over again in this class that that's a very painful thing to do. And people don't get reelected if people are starving. And if the farmers are mad, it's going to be very hard for Madison to get a new job. Actually, you're going to have to get a new job because you're no longer going to be a politician. This would be the video we would be watching if the theater actually had AV, but heaven forbid if theater have AV. All right, so governments can sometimes improve our market outcomes. So remember I just said that that was kind of a funky one where the politician wanted to make sure that his constituents kept voting for him, so he fixed the problem. But sometimes the government actually does get involved and economists are fine with it. 90% of the time, the biggest difference between an economist and a political science person is political science people think governments can fix everything, and economists think that basically if the politicians just left things alone, things would be much easier to run. If you just let the people vote with their pocketbooks, things would be a lot easier. But there are certain things that the government does that are really important to us in the United States and in many companies. For instance, would you want to have a company if you had no rights to keeping your property? If there wasn't somebody defending your ability to keep your factory where it is? If there was no police force to help you if somebody rioted outside? Probably not. This is the argument that happens a lot when you want to talk about property rights. Property rights have to do with the fact that you have the ability in the United States, if something goes wrong, to go to court, to talk to it over, and to hopefully fix it. You have the right to keep your property safe. Economically, this enables people to actually produce things. If without it, people would not produce. People would be less inclined to work, produce, or invest, or purchase things if they weren't sure that what they were making was going to be safe. Everybody wants to feel as though whatever they're making will stay safe, that they will have the ability to keep it. If you thought the government any day could come over and just snatch it away from you, would you have any incentive to make the best and to do the next iteration of it? You've got this great idea and you're going to make your widget even the bestest widget in the world, but you're not going to do it if you think the government's going to steal it next week. Patent laws. What is a patent? You get about 10 years, depending on what it is. If you didn't have that, what happens? You got it. There's where economists will say that's an incentive to inventing. And that is a natural way in which the government gets involved that is actually a positive. Now, there are all sorts of caveats to this, and we can get into the Chinese issue again, because that's a huge one with the Chinese, but let's not go there right now. Here's some things that the government can also help us with. Does anybody want a bunch of carcinogens being dumped into your water supply? Does anybody want a monopoly making your prices really high? No. These are called market failures. Market failures are when the allocation of your society's resources fails. Something happens in which the invisible hand and all the market forces that should be working together produce something that is necessarily negative to the country as a whole. Pollution is a big market failure. No one wants their children to have 25 toes. And that's a minor birth defect, right? But birth defects are huge. And in China, they're having a huge problem with this now because there are a lot of pollution issues. Externalities are when a market failure occurs and it affects somebody other than the person producing it. In other words, you do not have to buy the product that's being produced to actually be affected by that market failure. If you live downstream of a factory that's polluting that water, you are going to be affected regardless of whether you ever buy that product or not. That's the reason why markets get involved in things like the EPA, because those are market failures that do occur economically. So principle 7, the market can sometimes improve outcomes, has to do also with market failures and market power. Monopolies. Are monopolies good other than in a game? No. In the United States, we don't like monopolies because we believe that monopolies have a natural ability to basically hold prices artificially high. They don't tend to warrant innovation because there's no competition. And in general, the consumers lose. In the US, we have antitrust laws that prohibit monopolies 99% of the time. There is, however, one very large monopoly that does occur. What makes this projector work? Electricity. Electricity is a monopoly. It's a natural monopoly. We'll get into it later, but it doesn't make sense to have 5 electric companies all competing with each other. So, the government can sometimes make things more equal. And that is why economists say, yeah, we really don't like the politicians involved. Yeah, we prefer if they stay out of our economy. Don't touch it. I don't want you involved in it. But if you're going to have to, do it only if it's going to basically hurt people. Externalities, protecting property, these are good things you can get involved in. What about the whole notion of equality? This is probably the biggest economic issue of this time. Equality is huge. And right now, we as a country do not necessarily have everyone getting an equal set of the economic pie, do we? This is where economists really struggle, because how do you, we're on principle 7, right? Principles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. We're all about what? Driving the economy forward. But 7, we're saying, yeah, that's great, but it's not fair if everybody doesn't get, you know, the resources are everybody's, and if everybody isn't getting an equal share of the pie, maybe that's not so fair. It's the biggest dilemma of economics. And you'll have a very hard time finding a set of economists that agree on it. So, these are government situations. There's 4 of them. We're going to talk through each one of them. What's the government's role, and how does government intervention help or hurt the overall goal? In the United States, every child up until the age of 12th grade has the right to go to school, free. Right? Public schools are indeed a government's role in the United States. Do you think the government's intervention helps the product or hurts the product? By the way, there's no right answer. There are 45 of you in the class. Somebody better come up with an answer. Yes. Helps? And why do you think so? Equal opportunity. Every kid gets an opportunity to get educated. Unfortunately, not exactly the same education for every kid, is it? That's the unfortunate problem, isn't it? Should it be the same education for every kid? Should rich kids get a better education than poor kids? No, probably not. I don't think so. But then again, I live in Blue Valley and my kids get a Blue Valley education. Do I pay more for it? Yeah, probably. My property taxes are higher. Yep. Sandra?
With that, I say that with the government being involved, that it doesn't help the schools in actuality, because it is actually more of the community who pays for your children's schooling, because like Leavenworth County is broken up into each division. So Leavenworth pays for Leavenworth School, and their taxes go up and down. Lansing, they built a new high school. Our taxes went up to pay for that high school. The government did pay for that high school. We paid for that high school. And each child does not receive the same education, even though the government is saying now, like when I went to school, you flunked, you flunked. Now it's no child left behind. Everybody has to pass, even if they're not making the grade.
So to Sandra's point, the US government does provide, the state tells the state government they have to provide a certain amount of money per student to go to school. Lansing is a classic example. Lansing decided that that was not enough, that there was no way that they could make it work, that they needed a new high school. What did they do? I can't remember, I think it's a bond. Blue Valley has the Blue Valley Foundation. It's a nonprofit. It's actually a rather genius idea. It's a nonprofit in which they basically have corporations, etc., donating to it, and then they can basically fund things that the state funding doesn't allow. Arts, STEM education, things like that. But that requires funding, which requires money. Now, flip that over to a rural area or an inner city. Is everybody really getting the education they should? Should the government be spending more money on education? You'll see over and over again, economists will say that it's one of the biggest resources we have as a country is our workers. And if they're not educated, then that's a problem, isn't it?
And more now, because I work as a parent in the school district, you see more now that teachers don't teach. Teachers sit on a computer and do paperwork in your elementary, middle schools, and high schools. They do minimal teaching because it's more technology teaching now than teaching.
And that may be a problem too. What about workspace safety regulations? For instance, we're all sitting up here. You're all spread out, right? That's basically workspace safety regulations, right? The city of Leavenworth has decided that we have to be social distanced. The city of Leavenworth has decided that we have to wear masks. These are all regulations. What do you guys think about having other safety regulations, like for instance, children's labor laws? Those are all things that the state, that were put in place that are economically maybe not as feasible. I mean, when kids were working, they were cheap. Economically, it was probably a great idea to have kids work. Granted, they lost a few fingers. Well, you know, that happens. I'm just making that up, but basically, you know what I'm saying. That economically, that would be the argument. But this is, yeah, they didn't live as long. They were poisoned. Yes. Yes, my dear, I see you in the back.
I made an observation when I was moving back. I drove through a mining town to visit someone, like a family member, and they explained to me that a lot of the kids there, they go through these high schools and the elementary and stuff, and as soon as they get out, they're picked up by these mining companies to do jobs, and they're really good paying jobs, but it's like the high school is already teaching them stuff about that job already.
So the high school's become a tech school.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting notion. I mean, there's some pluses and minuses to it. One is a guaranteed job, not necessarily terrible. The minus is hopefully it's a safe job. Mining is not, it's notoriously known for being unsafe, so that's always an issue. But there is something to be said for tech schools, and tech schools have become very unpopular. But yet, if you think about it, is there anything wrong with the tech school? No. A tech school is great if you want to learn certain things. What about public highways? In the United States, we have a hell of a lot of them, don't we? Those are all things the government pays for. Those are all things we don't really pay for. Yeah, we pay a few tolls, but let's be really honest. That's not enough to cover the entire cost of a highway. Even the exorbitant toll I paid in North Carolina wasn't that much. Got in one place and it was a $10 toll. I'm like, really? What about patent laws? We talked about those. What's going to happen when the COVID vaccine comes out? Is that going to be patented? That's a good question. Does anybody know?
Who would be able to get the patent if you had a COVID? Because you have this country who had it, like China, had it first. So would they be able to get the patent, or is it?
No, the patent is
every country gets their own patent because they all design a different
vaccine.
vaccine.
So it would be the drug company designing a vaccine, right? Yeah. You can't patent the virus, but you can patent the vaccine, can't you? So we're enacting the War Power Act. I mean, I don't know. It's a good question. I know with polio, he did not take the patent. Actually, that's an interesting thing, an interesting fact. When Salk developed the polio vaccine, he did not take the patent. He took the patent and gave it to the world, which was an interesting thing. But he was a very interesting person. Abbott developed the very first penicillin pill. The very first pill Abbott Laboratories developed. They had that patent for 10 years. For 10 years, if you wanted penicillin, you had to buy Abbott Laboratories penicillin. It was the first antibiotic in oral form. It's an interesting question, and it does, that is one of the ones that, if we come up with a vaccine, is it worth, I mean, does the patent laws become void for that? It's a good question. I don't know the answer. Find out for me. All right, so how does the economy as a whole work? We did people. We did how they interact. We did the government. We found out the economists don't really like the government unless it's doing something that's really, really helping people. And now we're going to get to the economy as a whole. Oh, look at the world. All right. Economists truly believe that our standard of living is directly dependent on our ability to produce goods and services. And that really, if you look across different countries, you will find that the variation in living standards is directly correlated to the ability to produce goods and services. So the average income in rich countries, and when we say rich countries, we're talking about rich countries not only in the fact that they have high incomes, but they also have high gross domestic products, is 10 times the average income in a lower country. And our standard of living is 8 times higher than it was 100 years ago. And our GDP is quite a bit higher than that. And really what it comes down to is our productivity. How well are we producing the goods and services we produce? How well is each worker producing what they need to produce, and how efficient are they? So see how this directly correlates to education? Think about it. If you're can't read, if you can't follow simple directions because it's just something you never learned how to do, if you've never learned how to handle things mechanically or think through a process or think through or be able to know when something's going to go wrong because no one's taught you critical thinking. Now, these probably all sound like Nadoy things to you guys, but there are places where you don't learn these things. It is very hard to have a very productive workforce. If everybody's terrified to say anything, terrified to mention that something's gone wrong, terrified to mention when something is not right, you're going to have huge issues. When the United States first started producing in China, there was a large incentive to US companies to produce in China. This is the bitter economic irony of this entire thing. US companies were given incredible incentives to produce in China. I know the irony is immense. Anyway, at that time, one of the biggest problems they had was the Chinese had an enormous workforce, but none of their workforce could read. Chinese. Why? Because the majority of the population of China did not go to school. School in China was something you paid for. So needless to say, only certain people went to school. It was just the way it went. It wasn't necessarily anything bad or good. So, and then Mao came along and it got worse and worse and worse. But the point being was when we first started producing things over there, one of the things we had to start doing was learning how to make instructions so that people could learn how to do something without ever reading Chinese. And by the way, Chinese is extremely hard to read anyway. So it wasn't necessarily something that you just learned overnight. So they would create these instruction manuals that were based purely on pictures. And then they would teach one person. And then that person would have to teach another person. And then another person, etc. But because of the cultural differences, the American workforce were used to people raising their hands. Excuse me, if I do that first, and then I do this, and then I do this, the wheels come off the truck, right? That would be something a Ford motor worker would do, right? They say, no, you can't do it that way. You told them to do it, and guess what they did? Exactly the way you told them to. So it was also empowering people to talk through their problems. So the productivity of a workforce is a cultural issue as well as an educational issue. And that is part of the reason why richer countries also have better educational systems and have more freedoms. Because the worker has to be able to tell you when your idea is, as my husband's grandmother would say, mashigana, just dumb. Wait, that idea is stupid. You can't do it that way. The wheels are going to fall off 2 days later, right? If you don't put any oil on that axle, it's just going to literally rust, right? Those are the things you need somebody to tell you. So you have to have the skills, you have to have the equipment, you have to have the technology, and you have to have the ability of the people to actually use the technology. So what they say is, and this is an interesting thing because one of the things that's a big iffy on political sciences is that unions and competition from abroad have very little effect on the living standard of people if they're highly productive workforce. It's an interesting little economic fact. All right, we're on principle 9. Woohoo, we're almost done, guys. Money rises when the government prints too much money. Is this a shocker for anybody? Okay. Inflation. Inflation is an increase in the general level of prices. And if you take macroeconomics with me or anywhere else, you'll learn a lot about inflation. But inflation is literally the ability of your dollar to buy less than it was able to buy before. So it's basically all the prices, not just one, have to rise. So for instance, right now, we as an economy have found that the cost of food has definitely gone up. Yet the inflation rate overall in the United States is not any higher than it was last year. Maybe a tad, but like insignificant. Why is that? Because it's the general prices of all the goods and services that an economy produces. So that would include oil and electricity and cars and education and et cetera, and et cetera, and et cetera, right? So everything has to go up. If a government prints too much money, and by the way, so we're all clear on this, the Federal Reserve does not print money. Anybody want to guess who prints money? It says right on your dollar bill. The Department of Treasury. So no matter what anybody says, including our current president, who seems to have fallen asleep during economics class when it comes to this, the Federal Reserve cannot produce or make the money supply. Literally, they cannot put any more money in the economy. They can change the money supply by buying and selling bonds, but they cannot print money. That's my little public service announcement for today. I do not understand why he keeps saying that. Anyway, that's when I yell at the TV set going, were you paying any attention? You went to Harvard. I know your professor mentioned it. So if you start to print more money, and the Treasury Bureau has done this in a bunch of countries, what happens? It's not as worth as much. It's like anything. If you have too much of it, literally, just like supply and demand, remember we talked about it, if you have too much corn, the price of corn goes down. If you have too much money, every single piece, every dollar bill, let's say, is worth less. This is the classic example of dictatorships not understanding or paying attention during economics class. The last time this happened was in Zimbabwe. I think he was a dictator. The dictator of Zimbabwe panicked one day and realized that they didn't have enough money to pay their debts. So he started printing money. And in the process of doing so, literally caused one of the largest inflation rates ever. The previous one was previously, right before Hitler came to power, the Third Reich did it. Whatever that would have been. Who was that? Prince whatever. He printed too much money and actually probably helped Hitler gain power. So basically inflation like that is not good. You guys don't have to worry. The entire time you've been alive, the inflation rate hasn't, I think, been higher than 2%. So last thing is everything in economics is a trade-off. What do I mean by trade-offs? I mean the fact that nothing really happens without there being a trade-off. Now, this is the one economic policy that today is an abnormality. So I'm going to tell you this right now. Before we had COVID, we had what they call an economic abnormality. For the last 200 and something years, if unemployment went up, inflation went down. If unemployment went down, inflation went up. They had a inverse relationship to each other. They were a trade-off. And the idea was the Federal Reserve had a certain amount that they wanted to keep unemployment at, was about 4 to 5%, and they wanted to keep inflation at about 2 to 3%. And that was going to be a trade-off between the two. So they would be watching those two variables. Since the last Great Recession, the two have run in parity. This is an abnormality, but basically Principle 10 stands true for 200 and something years. We only have maybe a 3-year period in which it hasn't stood true. So basically economic policies will push inflation and unemployment in opposite directions, and hopefully we can keep them equal. I will tell you right now, it's not happening, but you know, insert something like COVID, no one can predict that one. But even before that, we weren't doing it, but usually it works in paired, they work like in opposites. So, what do we have? We've got a bunch of people. They're going to have trade-offs. Each one of us is going to make a ton of economic trade-offs. And everything is going to have a cost. It's going to be that foregone opportunity, and as a special name, opportunity costs, right? Rational people, and we assume that 99.9% of the economy is rational at any point in time. We could all find irrational people, but let's assume everybody's pretty rational. We'll make decisions by comparing the marginal cost versus the marginal benefit, like we did when we were with our Mustang. How much is it going to cost us to fix the transmission? How much are we going to benefit from selling it one way versus the other? And we all respond to incentives. Regardless of what we want to believe about people, people like incentives. Disincentives will make us not do things, like a tax. Incentives will make us do things. 401ks, perfect incentive. Defer your tax until you retire where your income will be lower. Great way, good incentive. What are we doing? We're encouraging people to save. People will interact. And in economics, trade is beneficial, and we'll spend a little time playing around with trade. Trade's fun. Markets are a good way to concentrate that trade and coordinate it and make sense to get together. We have an enormously great market now. It's called the internet. And we can do a lot of things on that market. Think of Amazon and how much we do there. Think about Etsy and how much we do there. There's so many different markets now, aren't there? And then governments can basically improve things. This is a big concession for economists. If there's a market failure, or if there's an inequality or an inequity, they should be able to help people. But just don't do it because your constituents are yelling. And then finally, here's the economy as a whole. Productivity is the ultimate source of living standards. The more productive we each are as a worker, the more productive the economy is, the more affluent we all are. If we print more money, we're going to have inflation. I know it's shocking. Luckily, there are fail-safes in the United States for this to happen, so it's very unlikely it will ever happen because of the Treasury going berserk unless we have some strange dictatorship. And society places a trade-off between inflation and unemployment in 99.9% of the economic situations, COVID aside. So, by Sunday of this week, what are you going to have done? Those pieces of paper. Mind top. You're going to post that piece of paper right there, right? You're going to take a picture of it and you're going to post it. Those are called interactive notes. Is that what we're going to do? Can we all do this? Okay, anybody has a problem, they panic. You text me, you pick up that little electronic device that's glued to your head. You text Professor Stanley, help! She usually responds, but she's asleep. Oh my goodness, You didn't get a response, you text her again in maybe an hour or two. If it's the middle of the night, she's probably not going to respond to you, but she will respond the next morning usually. If you do not hear from her, you text her again. But you must say it's an economics class, otherwise she's reading your mind. If you say something like, how do I get on that electronic thing that does homework? I'm not going to have any clue what you're talking about. You do have to remember I do teach 4 classes. Any questions? Anything about this that's been unclear? Any problems? I'm sorry this class ends up being a ton of lecture. Normally we do a whole bunch of activities, but we can't do them because we can't be together. But hopefully I can come up with some ways that we can do them electronically, okay? All right, go, run. Make sure you sign the sign-up sheet so I know you're here. So you don't have the homework?